Today I'm talking with fellow history podcaster Matt, who runs a podcast called Reflecting History. This is a show that I discovered just, doing the search, trying to find new history podcasts, things like that. I ran across his show. Actually, I was listening to an interview that he did with S.C. Gwynn, and then that sent me down the rabbit hole, and I discovered his narrative history series. He's a great podcaster. He's one of my favorites, and he talks a lot of times. It's a blend of narrative and theme, and he tends to go into this idea of how do we know what we know, and can we trust what we know? He really interrogates sources and dives into different thematic elements and different things like that. And I'm bringing him on here today to talk about the nuts and bolts of history podcasting. What's it actually look like to produce a history podcast? This is something I wish somebody would have put out there when I was starting. I've wanted to kind of have a place where you can talk about some of the actual nuts and bolts of what it looks like. There's a few articles out there. Some benevolent history podcasters have put out their process or put out some of the nuts and bolts about what it actually means to make a history podcast, what you're signing up for. That's something I wanted to dive into in this episode today and give you another resource if that's something that remotely interests you. Maybe you have kicked around the idea of starting your own podcast, and you can take bits and pieces of this and apply it to what you want to do. This is also, history podcasting is not like your typical run-of-the-mill podcast. There's a formula, and there's a lot of information out there about what it means to start a podcast, how to start a podcast, and how to get things rolling there. But doing a history podcast, it's a little bit different. Typically, your episodes and your cadence of posting are going to look a little bit different. And I think that's okay, and you just sort of bake it in there. But it does mean that you have to have a little bit of a different conversation about what it means to be a history podcaster, what it means to actually interrogate sources and do research and those other elements that go into this. So in this episode, in this interview, Matt and I talk about that. And because we are history podcasters, we broke this interview into two parts. The first part is right here that you're listening to now, but there's a second part on Matt's podcast feed, which will be linked below, where we talk about more of the practicing history part of this. Some of the zany historical questions that you might run into. If you're a history major, you've probably had these kinds of conversations. What does it mean to, factor in bias to history? How can we know that things actually happened? The morality that's in history, things like this. Can you judge people in the past based on modern moral sentiments? Those sorts of things. So part one, nuts and bolts of what it actually means to have a podcast, how to produce it, how to process audio, how to research, those sorts of things. And then part two over on Matt's feed, it's a little bit more about, some of the zany historical questions, and it's really, really fun. I had a blast having this conversation with Matt, and I'm sure we'll probably do it again here at some point. But sit back, relax, enjoy part one, and then when you're done, go check out part two in Matt's podcast feed. We had an absolute blast doing it. Thank you so much for listening, for rating, reviewing, and all those wonderful things. And without any further ado, let's get into the history podcasting process with Matt.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
There can be no peace in the world until the military power of Japan is destroyed.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
How do you view your role as the podcaster? And we had said we wanted to talk about this, but you had mentioned imposter syndrome. earlier. I don't remember if that was going to end up in the recording or not, but, do you feel as if you being the authority when presenting your podcast is something that is important? Do you view yourself as an enthusiast? What's the difference between a historian and a podcaster? So I'd be curious to get your take.
It's going to be a fluid answer because I have incredible imposter syndrome. I don't know what would make that go away. I don't know if it ever would, even if I became incredibly knowledgeable about a subject. I feel like there's always going to be somebody in a place of power that could tear it down. I talked to Mike Cole, who's written several books. You could consider him a historian. He has published works of history in my book that makes you a historian. And he wrote a book called The Bronze Lie, where he pointed out this narrative that Spartans weren't as awesome as you think they were. And the Bronze Lie is that they were awesome. And the Bronze Lie generates from one of the most, maybe the preeminent Spartan historian in the world right now, a guy named Paul Cartledge, who's written excellent books. He is an extremely venerated historian. When he speaks, people listen. Well, Mike Cole writes this book that debunks a lot of the things that Cartledge says about Spartans, and he backs it up. The work, it's not just, a shot thrown on Twitter. There's work there. There's history being done. And Cartledge came after him. And he said, when I was talking to him, that was hugely formative for him, but also in a good way, because he realized that even though Cartledge could come after him, he couldn't debunk his work. And so I took several things from that. One, there's always somebody around the corner, and you're not making the show to satisfy everyone. You're not writing the book if that's what you're doing, to satisfy everyone. There's a process, and there's work that goes into it. And I think if you do the work effectively, it doesn't matter if you're not a credentialed historian. Regular folks can do historical work if they do the work. And I think that's the part that you kind of default to, is the thing that you make good? And if the thing you make is good, somebody might have a problem with it. And that's fine. But I think if the work is good, it kind of, I think you need to be able to take some self-satisfaction away from that. And that's harder said than done. Because tackling Vietnam, it's a huge subject. And I'm sure I've misrepresented some things. And, like I said, there's a couple things that I think I probably got wrong in the process. But, I feel like I've done good work. I feel like I have researched, and for this type of story I was trying to tell, I feel like I've, developed a narrative throughout, the process that is good. And I think it's good work. So I don't know. I don't know how you feel about it. I think
it's a tough one.
It's so tough. And two, if you're going to publish a book, I feel like there's almost another, it's almost like a related but somewhat different conversation. The bar is a little bit higher maybe. I don't know that the bar is as high if you're making a podcast. I think people will accept a little bit less. And that's not because people are, accepting of poor history narrative, but that they just don't expect you to be the preeminent voice on the thing you're talking about. I think people are willing to just have a conversation about this thing. And if you know more than they do about it, that kind of puts you at a place where you can do that. But even still, like there's kind of like a weird gray area where, you want to know as much as you can, but also you got to release stuff. So you can't just spend 3 years researching something. Like you got to get something out every month or two, and at the end of the day, there's like a soft deadline in there.
Yeah, I think I've thought about this a lot, and I think we're just podcasters. Like I think that's the label that you give us, and I don't think that we're historians.
Yeah.
I don't think that, one of the things that that I've come away with doing my podcast and even having the opportunity to interview a few historians on my podcast, what they do is really time consuming and intensive. And I mean, you could pull one of those Richard J. Evans World War II books off my shelf right now, and just reading the footnotes or the bibliography of that book would literally be a 3-hour podcast, like just reading the footnotes.
There's nothing more humbling than reading the bibliography of like a really big history book, and it's like 15 pages, tiny font of just sources, and you're like, oh,
yeah,
okay.
But I don't think we have to be necessarily historians to do what we do, and I think we have an awesome opportunity, like you said, where if we do it good and if we execute it, and if we are able to make a connection with people, I think the best way to think about it is, almost like being a teacher or being, like a low-level professor, right? Where you're building relationships with people, you are, presenting hopefully something interesting and historical and new for them, and hopefully you're using that to do some good in the world, right? And maybe show people, hey, like here's different perspectives on this topic, and here's how trends and forces and systems can impact you in your life, right? And here's how critical thinking matters, and here's the difference between living an examined life, right, and thinking about these things, which I think is step one, versus not doing those things. And to me, if that's my goal, then I'm not super worried, how many downloads I have, or, am I, in the same class as this podcaster or this historian, or, so for me, I usually try to keep that in mind if I ever have that kind of feeling of imposter syndrome, or, a lack of expertise or anything like that would kind of prevent me from keeping going with this thing.
Yeah, there's I'm trying to find a quote here. There's a French historian named Marc Bloch who wrote a book where I think it's called Writing History, or maybe it's Life in History, or something like that. It's essentially a historian writing a book about the craft of being a historian. And he's got a quote in the book where he says, "Tell me what you know, but also how you know it." Mm. And it's referring to, like, if he's having a conversation with a student or another historian, it's tell me what the facts are, but it's tell me also how you arrived at those facts. And I think if you could like dumb down the process, it's finding the facts and then figuring out how you arrived at those facts. And I think you're right.
And then communicating them, I think, is
right.
Some people can do those first two things, and then the communication, for maybe a bunch of different reasons, would fall apart.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Adding in that extra element of, you have a really complicated topic and you just can't convey it. Like, that is its own extra can of worms. This is just the like step 1, step 2. There's a whole step 3 and 4 maybe that's in addition to.
I interrupted you, sorry, but keep going.
No. I mean, I think I think, like I said, podcasters are not held to the same standard, but I do think there needs to be a standard. And I think you did touch on this. I don't know exactly, like, I don't know if you can put into words specifically what that standard is of like historicity and, and fact. And I think it's approach. And I'm curious your take on this. I think that if you have a respect for history and like an appreciation of it, and maybe even a love for it, if you want to go that far, you will attempt to tell the narrative the correct way. That doesn't mean that you'll get everything right. It doesn't mean that you won't potentially make some mistakes. But I think if you approach it with the correct posture, that probably covers up a lot of sins.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. There's a standard, right? And I try to meet that standard, right? And if the podcast sucks, then it sucks. But like, it's not going to suck because I didn't put a ton of thought into it and it wasn't well researched. And, there will never be a moment where I just like, all right, guys, I'm going to hit record and, see
we'll
what
see
happens.
what we get.
Yeah. Like, and hey, maybe, you experiment with things and maybe something like that becomes an interesting way to do things. But, I'm trying to get at what you're saying there, where you have a respect for the subject, you have a respect for the topic. When you're dealing with history, I think it's interesting to me because you're dealing with people, right? They're not alive anymore, but, you would want someone to tell your story with a respect to it, right? And you would not want to be dismissed historically, for whatever reason, and you would want the person telling that story to understand you and hopefully try to do you justice, right? So I try to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I think you can tell, and maybe it's just in like, format and medium and approach, but I think you can somewhat tell when somebody cares about what they're doing, and it comes across in the details, it comes across in the approach, it comes across in, learning the actual like podcasting part of it, going from, there's an audio element here. I think if you really care, it extends even into that. Like there's the historical process, there's the processing process, there's the, recording process. Like, and there's a Jerry Seinfeld quote, and I think he's talking to like Harvard Business Review or something, and he's talking about creative process. And I think they were asking him, like, maybe it was he had the opportunity to have a writer's room do another season of Seinfeld or something instead of just him or something like that. Like there was an opportunity to do something an easier way than he had been doing it, and he turned it down. And they were baffled because there was a significant amount of money to be made if he would have done it the easy way. And he said it wouldn't have been good because that thing was created the hard way. And if I would have done it the easy way, it wouldn't have been any good because I would not have been in it. And I think there's that part of it where, like, anytime you're doing something creative, if you are in it and you're putting part of you in it, it really can't suck. Maybe there's parts that can be like somewhat incorrect, and you kind of correct those as you come across the corrections, but it really can't suck all that bad.
Yeah. When you were saying that Seinfeld quote, I don't know how much you want to get into this, and I've found that people have strangely strong opinions on this subject, but it reminded me a little bit of using like AI. And, me personally, I think for a lot of people, AI can be a useful tool, and, and obviously it's revolutionizing everything, but I don't use it at all really in my show. And you articulated the exact reason why, because I feel like if I did, the show would not be good anymore, because it's not it's not the standard that I have,
Yeah.
And that's not to say you couldn't plug in, hey, do a Reflecting History AI podcast and it would end up being better than mine, but it wouldn't be my show. And that's kind of why I really don't mess around with it too much. But I don't know. That was a great Seinfeld quote.
Yeah. No, I wish I could. Part of me wishes, I don't wish, but part of me wishes I could just go in there and be like, okay, I'll feed you 10 hours of my show. Give me
10 more hours.
Right. Outline another show for me. But like it does rob the thing that makes it what it is.
It's the process.
It's the process. And I think, yeah, I really enjoy the process part of it. I love the routine that it creates, and how it's something that's kind of always stewing in the back of my mind, especially when you're in the midst of recording something. When you're scripting something, I feel like you don't have this quite as much, but when you're doing it, and I think you do this the same way, it is planned, but it's freestyled. And when you're doing it that way, there's like a fugue state that you almost get into, and I don't know exactly how it is for you. Maybe this is just how it is for me, but like you get into this state where you're like, I'm just punching the clock on it for 3 weeks or whatever, however long I'm recording on it. And you get to the end and the process kind of created the thing that you have. And obviously there's more to it than just like, I sat down and recorded for 20 minutes and I have 15 minutes of usable audio, but like there is kind of a cycle almost to the creative process that I think is special just by itself.
And it's interesting, for me at least, it's like basketball, where there's some nights where you're on and there's some nights where you're not on, and it's not necessarily something that you can plan for or prepare for. So yeah, for me, 98% of my shows are not scripted. I don't script them out. I do have an outline. I do have dozens, hundreds of pages of notes that I reference. And I have those in front of me. And of course I have the books and the sources in front of me as well. But I don't like the sound of a scripted podcast, to be honest. Like me personally, it feels like I'm listening to an audiobook. And I've gotten more into audiobooks lately, but I've never been a huge audiobook guy. It's hard for me to ingest the information and remember it from an audio perspective. The way audiobooks tend to be read, I'm much more likely to remember something from a podcast, kind of that style of talking. But, other people probably are different, which is fine. But yeah, so I don't script much, but if I feel like things are getting very complex and complicated, I might script out that episode, or I might script out a paragraph of something that I really have to get right. Like, I'm talking about some super important thing that the details really matter, and it has to be exactly perfect, or I'm going to get, I'm not going to live up to that standard that I talked about earlier, right? So that is when I kind of resolve to that. But yeah, I don't know how you do it.
Yeah, I mean, do
you have notes and stuff in front of you, or you just let it rip?
I've got notes. I usually am surrounded by books. I think it would change based on the subject matter, but at least with the Vietnam shows, I had like 3 or 4 books that were kind of like the backbone books of the entire thing. And they were different because the subject matter was broad. So like the first Indochina War, I had 2 books that were kind of the main books. And in the Vietnam War, I probably had, it was probably 2. Three. There was three like main books that were kind of just, I pulled most of the narrative from those books, and then I supplemented with firsthand accounts. And so by the end of it, theoretically, you have like a pretty well fleshed out thing. But what that meant was, and I think this is just me, I need to get better at this. My outline and plan is terrible. It's literally just a bunch of, it's like, this book right here, page 300, halfway down. It's another book, page 250, top right.
Oh, that's making me just sick right now. Oh my God. I would get it. Oh my God.
And I have like, I've got all the sticky notes and stuff. I need to get better. So, but for this last show, it's some of that, but then it's also, I'll put some quotes in a Google Doc and then I'll refer back to those. But sometimes it's also like scribbles. And so it'll be like, hey, I want to talk about Vietnamization. Here's 3 quotes. Here's 2 references from a book. And also sometimes I just like reread the books a little bit. And so I might sit down to record for an hour and I have 15 minutes of audio out of it, just because it's like, you got to like rewrap your mind around the idea, make sure you're saying it right, and then make it flow. And I don't know, like it's a very organic process that I would really love to do better. The 1066 show was not like this. I had a pretty decent outline. And even in sections, like there was probably a 30-minute section that it was not scripted, but everything in the show for about 30 minutes was in a Google Doc. And that was just quote, sinew to kind of like bind the quotes together, like maybe a little paragraph of here's what's next, quote, more sinew paragraphs, quote. And it was that for, 20 pages of a Google Doc. I would like to do more of that. And I think I've just found like I can do more work on the front end and then figure it out while I'm recording, or I can do more figuring out while I'm recording and less work on the front end. And I tend to really like figuring it out while recording. And so I'll know I got to read this book and this book to touch on this subject. And then I might just spend, instead of like a week and a half of recording, I might spend 3 or 4 weeks recording. And at the end of it, it is what it is. And then I just go back and fix all the stuff that stinks.
That's interesting because I do the reverse, where I feel like I spend much more time on the front end, and as I'm reading something, when I'm doing my notes, if I see something that I want in there, like I make very clear in the notes, like exactly where that is, when that's going in, what is going before and after, because I know I will forget. Like I'll be honest, I just don't have a good memory. So,
all those sticky notes theoretically are that, but that doesn't mean that every single one of those made it into a show somewhere. So, I don't know. I was listening to a show where a historian was like detailing his research process, and it was far more buttoned up. And it was like, he goes and reads and pulls all the things that he wants, and then he organizes it to where he can actually see everything in front of him and print it out. And then he gets to work. And I was like, I need to do more of that.
Yeah, so I do a version of that where when I sit down to record, like it's not scripted, it's off the cuff, but I have the notes and I know I have a plan. I have a game plan in front of me, and I generally stick to that plan. And if I don't, I'm making notes on the game plan, and it's almost like a defensive coordinator, changing based on what the offense is doing type of deal.
Did you ever write anything, like any fiction or anything like that?
Not officially.
Okay, unofficial. There we go.
Not anything we can talk about. No.
Were you more of a pantser or a plotter?
I didn't know what I was, but Yeah, I guess George R. R. Martin talks about the gardener or the architect. And he, to his great detriment, or, you know, I mean, we could do a whole podcast on George R. R. Martin. I'm sure we could. But he's a gardener, right? So whatever the idea is, he's going to follow it and go for it. And somebody like Brandon Sanderson, more of a architect where everything's outlined out and that kind of thing. I'd say I'm somewhere in the middle, but I'm closer to the architect than the gardener, for sure.
So I've got a working theory that might now have been somewhat confirmed, that I think just like writers are a bit more of a gardener or an architect, I think podcasters are somewhat the same way. But not enough people are podcasters and talk about process for us to like have that conversation. But I think it's very much in this, because I was the gardener when I would write. Like I've written 2 novels that will never, ever see the light of the day. They are stuck in a trunk. And I was always a gardener. And with this, I wanted to be an architect. Like I wanted to have everything super duper planned. And I just don't like doing outlining prior to doing the thing. I love doing the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so that has translated probably somewhat to my detriment with making Compendium. Like I want it to be very, very well put together before I sit down and record. And in some parts I have to, because otherwise it just won't work unless I really know what I'm doing. But I also like the freedom to just go off on a tangent and come up with a anecdote or a comparison. And I just like recording. I like sitting down and just kind of like almost verbally processing the information, but then also trying to tie it to the narrative. So I think there's an element of that too. And I think other podcasters would say, you're a crazy person. Like you need to plan more, otherwise you're going to literally go insane. And I think there's probably some truth to that, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I enjoy recording, but it's interesting because I would say of the components of the process, for me, recording is a part that I am most frustrated by. And
interesting.
Yeah, it's the part, like I love the research part, like reading the books, thinking.
And I love reading the books.
Thinking about the things, writing down the notes, like that makes me happy. And
the part that I don't like is writing down notes.
And I don't mind editing.
Everything else is great.
I don't mind editing, which we could talk about, but I have a kind of a streamlined operation for that, and
I'm curious because
that makes it easy.
I feel like I've got a pretty decent process for editing, but I'm curious what yours is.
So the secret to editing is just not cutting anything out of your. No, I'm kidding.
Brilliant. The secret is don't edit.
Yeah.
The secret is punch and roll record and never edit.
Yeah. So I try to do as much as I can on the front end. So when I'm recording, I am able to kind of be a little bit disengaged, you know, have that secondary presence where if I'm recording something, I just have this spidey sense, okay, that sucked, we need to re-record that, and I'll just hit stop and restart, right?
Yep.
And I will do those sorts of edits. So, you know, I'm not editing out, you know, coughs and sneezes and ums and ahs very much because I'm locked in and that sort of thing. And then the other secret for me is I'm pretty good at editing at like 3 times speed.
Yeah.
And my voice sounds like a chipmunk, and because I know the ums and ahs are not there and the coughs are not there, so I can just focus on what I'm saying, and I can ingest that at that speed. And that really, when I figured that out, that's sped things up tremendously, because editing is such an arduous process. People don't understand that.
Audio is way worse too. I think when you don't have the video element, it's so tough.
Yeah.
I'm kind of the same way. I don't like editing. I don't like editing audio. Because I can disengage from it pretty easily. So I try and get it pretty good once the recording's done. So I do a lot of, I call it punch and roll, but there's like how you do it. There's no ums and ahs and things like that in there. So typically once I get to like a rough draft, I usually only have to listen to it 3 or 4 times and cut out things that I'm not listening for like verbal mistakes so much as I'm listening for like content mistakes, because the verbal mistakes have already been gotten out in the recording process. And
Exactly.
I would sing the praises of setting up hotkeys.
Yep.
And doing like look up audiobook narration tips, because those people it's the same thing for them. They're having to record a 6-hour, 8-hour audiobook. They don't want to sit down and edit an 8-hour audiobook. They want to get it right when it's recorded. So just do what they do. And that's been so helpful. Because I like the 1066 show, I edited. Like it was a traditional, I record, I have a bunch of mistakes in the recording. I go out and fix them. And it took me like 3 weeks and it was awful. But I don't really have to do that anymore, and it's been so good.
Yeah. I undersold the nuts and bolts of it, right? Where, you have the hotkeys, and after you record 100 episodes, you figure out exactly what you need to do on your audio program, and you have the hotkeys set up. And so literally my mouse is my right hand, my left hand's sitting on the keyboard, and I'm going. Like it's a machine.
I've even set up my processing to hotkeys. I hit 2 buttons and it's done.
Yep.
I normalize it and then I compress it and we're done and we're out of there. And I might add a little bit of a limiter to cut out some mouth sounds, but like I am such a huge fan of like making it so easy on yourself for like the granular stuff so that you can just focus on the content. And thankfully with audio recording specifically, like removing the video aspect, because I think that makes it really difficult, just audio recording, you can do it to where you don't have to really worry about some of those things.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if we're going to be allowed to publish this, but the secret of audio podcasting is that, believe it or not, Dan Carlin is not talking for 5 consecutive hours without a single mistake.
No, he is not.
When he makes his podcast. But yeah, like if you're someone listening to this and you're thinking, hey, I'm not sure I can do this, you can. The magic of editing is impressive, and you don't have to be able to talk for 5 straight hours. For me, usually I record into the mic in increments of anywhere from 30 seconds to 5 minutes, right? And if I'm rolling, I keep it going. If I'm not rolling, I pause it, take a drink of water, review my notes, start up again.
It's so funny how you'll have like sections where it's laborious to get a minute recorded. But then like I recorded an extra show for Patreon that'll go out after part 5 is out. And it's like 25 minutes, and I recorded it solid in one take. And I was like, oh, wow. Okay, I guess I just had that in me. But like trying to read a quote, I might get half the quote before I'm like, blah, blah, blah. Like, yep. And then it's, okay, let's go back. Let's do it again.
And what's interesting is me making these podcasts has changed the way that I listen to podcasts. And
oh, absolutely.
I can tell those moments in other podcasts. Like when Dan Carlin takes a break, I can actually tell. And I feel like 99.9% of the population would never be able to tell the subtle change in his voice when, those edits happen. And so in some ways it's cool, but in other ways it's like, wow, I wish I just never would have edited anything and I could just listen to things normally.
Spoiler alert. In part 5 in the recording process, I had a cold. And so I recorded like what is it, 3.5 hours. I probably did like an hour of it with a cold, or like managing a cold. I think you can probably tell, but it was like,
move.
yeah, I know. it was good enough that I was like, okay, I don't need to cut this. I don't sound like disgusting, but it's just like a little bit more nasally than normal. Again, we'll see. Might have been a massive mistake. Like you get the cold and you're like, well, I guess I've spent a month already. I kind of want to get something out, and we're just going to truck through it and see what I get.
Yeah, I mean, that's just part of the thing. You feel like you're on. You know, MJ didn't stay home during the flu game. He went out there and he balled out for 37 points, man.
He had the flu game.
Was it 37?
I was curious.
Or...
It might have been like 37 or 40. Yeah. It was great.
Okay.
I'm curious. You do this more than I do. I think I would like to do some more of this. But you'll have, you mentioned your Aztec show not really being built around events, and I think to some extent I know where you're going with that, but it is tied together with a through line of events. So it's narrative, but also like I get how you're saying it's more thematic, because that's what jumped out to me when I was listening to it. I was like, oh wow, this is really cool how it's not focusing specifically on events, but it has the through line. And so you've got that, but then you also have shows where, for lack of a better term, I just call them like idea shows. Just kind of like a cool aspect of this. I'm trying to remember one of the names of them, and I was scrolling through actually, and I had screenshotted them, and then I was having phone problems. But you'll have shows that it's just more of like a conversation, less about events and more about, hey, here's this interesting thing. You know, shoulder shrug. We'll see where it goes. I'm curious the different approaches for something like that, because I feel like they're very different, and for you they might be very, very similar. But maybe it's theme without events, or maybe it's events tied to theme. I don't know. How do you kind of approach something like that?
You know, I think before you ask that question, it's not something I think about very much. I think the idea comes and then you try to execute the idea. And I've always felt that, like, you try to stay open, you know, have your antenna up, and when the idea hits, you take it and run with it. So, you know, the podcast is history, psychology, and philosophy, right? Like those three things. So for me, anything that falls in those three categories is fair game. And ideally, I'd like to talk about all three of those things at the same time. So, for example, you know, one of those shows you might be referencing, more of like an idea show, was I did one on a Kazuo Ishiguro novel called The Buried Giant, where the theme of the book is like forgetting your history. And I think that's Kazuo Ishiguro is amazing. I don't know if you've read any. Have you ever read one of
I haven't,
Ishiguro
no.
books? Yeah, you should check one of those out. Never Let You Go, Remains of the Day, Buried Giant, super good
I'm gonna
books.
write that down.
But yeah, the idea is like, you know, the characters are fantasy characters, but they are living out a forgotten history, and they're remembering it as the book is going on. And then I don't want to spoil the book, but there's something that happens at the end that like kind of totally changes how you view history, and kind of, you know, those types of questions about historical narratives and historical memory and collective memory. And, you know, so for me, it's like, okay, that's what I want to talk about. So I have shows like that, and then I do have kind of more just traditional history shows. I've done series on, the Taiping Rebellion and the Cultural Revolution, and Nazi Germany, and so I think having that variety is something, in my opinion, that makes my show unique. Is that I don't see a lot of other, podcasts jumping from the Aztec Empire to Cormac McCarthy to Kazuo Ishiguro to, the trolley problem. So to me, that makes it unique, and it keeps things interesting for me because it lets me bounce around from topic to topic. But I do think, in some ways, from a maybe audience growth perspective, it might limit me a little bit because I think some people might be a little weirded out when they tune in for the Aztec Empire and then they get 8 episodes of that, and then the next episode is, Sigmund Freud or something. It's kind of a radical shift. But I think if you've been around for a while, you hopefully will start to see that's not, I view it more as like chapters in a book, kind of smaller chapters in a bigger book that's telling a bigger story. And that's kind of how I view the project as a whole.
I was going to save this question for later, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it anyway. To somebody who is wanting to start a history show and they don't know what to expect, what would you tell them?
How much time you got?
All the time in the world. Because I've been doing it for almost a year, and I still feel like I have just started because I've touched on 2 subjects and I've done a couple interviews. So I feel like still the world's my oyster, and I've learned a lot. But a year seems like a long time for a traditional show. For a history show, it's like 2 minutes. It's different. Time moves different. So I'm curious too.
So I think, first of all, there's a lot of great advice out there, and there's pretty standard advice that you're going to get for starting a history show. And I don't know if my opinion is the right way or the wrong way. But I can say what I think about the standard advice. So one thing I see a lot is when you first start, you should have a library of episodes. And this one I kind of agree with. So when I first started, I had 2 episodes, and then I quickly realized, after not being able to come up with an idea, that I was screwed.
Yeah.
So I wish I had 10 episodes in the bag to kind of let me, maybe do some promotion, maybe do some marketing, maybe take a second to think about the overall direction instead of frantically trying to figure out what episode 3 is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
So, don't be like me and get in the situation where you're at episode 4 and you're like, holy shit, people are actually listening to this thing.
I've got to do another show and I don't know what to do.
Right. So I think that's good advice is record 5 episodes and have those in your pocket. Another thing, and we talked about this earlier, and I don't remember if this was before we pressed record or not, but probably the number one advice you get is like find your niche or find your specific lane.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is bad advice, and I think obviously for someone who does a podcast that bounces from all the topics we just discussed, like I'm going to think that's not my thing. But to me, like if you are, and you said this earlier, if you're starting the podcast where you are, trying to find the audience before you make the thing, then I think you just have it backwards. Like, I think you should make something that you personally enjoy, that you enjoy the process of, and then once you kind of make that, you can figure out, okay, who's my audience, who's my community, how do I promote it? But I think kind of going in and restricting yourself at first, like, would not be the thing that I do. I don't know. What do you think about that?
No, I think that's right. I think especially with this, podcasts are a bit copycat. I mean, anything creative is copycat, but this style of show, I think, is such a tiny minority in like the wealth and dearth of podcasts that exist. Most podcasts are some iteration of Joe Rogan. And I think there's a formula to that style of show that people generally know what works. The thing that we're doing does not exist a whole lot. I think, I mean, you've got some of the bigger ones, but just in terms of, hey, let's do a multi-hour deep dive into a historical subject, I honestly can only think of a handful. And maybe that's just I haven't networked enough. but there's just not as many that are doing it, and so there's not as much of a formula.
I think a lot and and go, too. Like,
yeah.
Again, like I feel weird saying this, like imposter syndrome maybe, but I've been around 10 years and I've seen podcasts come and go, like and you start realizing exactly what you're saying, like how difficult it is to do exactly what you said, like just a deep dive sort of thing into history or anything really.
Yeah. I think with this, and maybe this is a lot of copy and paste of what like novel writing advice is, because I think they're very, very similar in terms of a creative pursuit. They're just manifest differently. But I think the advice that I hear a lot that I feel like would translate is, don't do it expecting it to make you money. Yeah. Do it because you love it. And if you don't love it enough, quit. If you do it and you love it, keep doing it, and maybe it'll make you money, but probably not.
Yeah. So, I mean, it kind of sounds like we're in the mindset zone before you even get into the advice of, do this or do that or don't do this. Like, I do think there's a certain approach that if you don't have that approach, things might go great, and I hope they do for you, but my bet would be they wouldn't go great.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be due to what you expect out of it. Like, what are you trying to get out of it? I mean, I've done other podcasts that have a bit more of a formulaic kind of approach, and you just show up every week and you have an episode go out. And that's great. And they were fun. There's another one that I do that like nobody will ever see the light of day. And I do it with a buddy, and we release an episode roughly every week. But it has no social media presence. I think 30 people listen to it every week. Like, it's not about that. This show has seemed to have legs, and it's probably because I was doing the social media part on the side, and then the social media part kind of developed legs, and then the history show kind of tagged along right behind it. But even still, it's got a lot more legs than I initially thought it would, but it's not like it's, I'm not paying any bills with it, and there's very small chance I will in any sort of like future, just because like I guess expectations, I think, have a lot to do with how much you enjoy it.
Yeah.
And the mindset that you go into it with. Like, I think if you're starting it with the goal of making it your job, it's probably just the wrong way to do it. I would love, like, there are few things I would enjoy more than doing this full time as my job. But like, I think if that's even, if that's even in the back of your mind, I think that's probably not why you need to do a show like this. Now, I think other podcasts are probably built more for that kind of a thing. And I think this format's just not really built for that. But I will say this, and I have noticed this. People who stick with you on a show like this are far, far, far more committed and loyal than any other format that I've tried.
Yeah, I can attest to that. And I know I have some of the best people who listen, and some of that is friends who reach out randomly and just like, hey man, listen to your thing on the Roman Empire. Like, that was awesome. It's like,
yeah,
well, shit, man, that's awesome. Thank you. And some of it is strangers giving you money on the internet who never say a thing to you, but they continue to offer support. And I think that's hopefully what I was trying to say earlier, and I know that you've been saying that too, is like, my advice would be just be professional and be respectful of the opportunity to kind of, make a difference for somebody. And that's, when I hear that from listeners, that's the best thing that's worth more than money. I had somebody reach out one time and just say like, hey, thanks for doing those book episodes and movie episodes. Like, and it's like, and those are the ones I'm always like, well, like sometimes I think people expect history and they get, The Road by Cormac McCarthy, and then to hear like, hey, this is working for me and it made a difference for me. Like, that's awesome. And I think in a world where the trusted institutions of the past are either completely immolated or crumbling apart, and even things like public education, which I have worries about, and the legacy media and the government, and even like the influencers and the podcasters. It's like now, some of those who were trusted, you wonder, has this whole thing evolved into, the amount of money people can make, and, who can I trust? So, I don't know. My point is, when you do this, like, I hope that you take it seriously and have a responsibility to get things right and to try to promote, the truth and be kind to people, and be willing to admit when you're wrong about things, and, not just be in it for clicks, and, don't stir up internet drama and, engagement. Like, I don't know, for some people that's the thing, but like for me, it's more about just trying to make something that matters to people.
Yeah, and I try and never take it for granted. I think recently, within the past couple months, Compendium's gotten to a point where people are noticing it, and it's still small, but I had a few episodes initially, and this is just how podcasts go. Like, it's a long-term thing. Like, you really can't expect to even know how it's going to go for like a year or two. Like, it's a long-term prospect. But the fact that people do listen and then, will comment something, or send an email or whatever, like those sorts of comments, I try and never take them for granted. And I try and always tell people, like, I do this for me, but having people along for the ride and enjoying it, it's one of the most rewarding things ever. Because I put what I feel like I put part of me into it, and there's an amount of work that I think once you get to a certain point, it's like I really, really hope somebody cares about this. Because I have spent, if you count the hours up, there's a lot. And you just hope like that they impact somebody in even a small way. And when anybody says that it has, it's unbelievable. It will make my day without fail. Like it doesn't even matter if it's just like hey, love the show. Great, day made.
Yep.
I'm stoked. It's one of the most rewarding things ever.
Yeah, so I think, again, like a lot of that is not the nuts and bolts of making a podcast, but my advice, I think, starts before that. But back to the nuts and bolts, I think another piece of advice you get that I do, and the advice is release regularly. So you will see that's like the number one thing people say, like, you need to do this with your podcast. So like once a week, once every 2 weeks, once a month, whatever it is. So I do once every 3 weeks because I just found over the years that's what allows me to balance my, my personal life and work with being able to do my hobby, which is this. I think if I do every 2 weeks, it would become overwhelming. And I think once a month feels a little too sparse for me, but yeah, I don't know if that's good advice, to be honest. Like, I think there's something to be said for not knowing when an episode's going to come out, and then you get like a little surprise in your day. It's like, oh, here's an episode of Compendium. Like, he finished part 5. Like, that's pretty cool. I'm going to check that out. So I know you don't seem to release regularly.
I want to. Do
you want to? Like, the more I do this, the more I have considered, like, hey, maybe I just go to a different formula where it's not every 3 weeks. It's maybe there's one every 2 days for a week, and then there's nothing for 2 months. And, I don't know.
Yeah. This is why I started doing some interviews to supplement, because I knew it was going to take a while to make the main shows. And I wanted to have something. And I knew, like, there was no chance I could release one of these I initially thought, like, every 3 weeks I'll have an episode. Zero chance. I spent 4 weeks just recording this one, minus the research and the editing and everything else. So, like, and I only read one book for part 5. Like, I'd already read all the books, but it was just figuring it out and doing the thing. Like, it just, and, to factor in, like, work and family life and things like that, like, it just wasn't going to happen. I hope I can get a show out every 4 to 6 weeks. But even still, like, now that I'm departing from Vietnam and starting another subject, that seems so daunting to, like, now turn around and do a compendium show. Because I feel like I've set a bar of, like, people know what a compendium show is. And to go back to that level with a new subject where I'm not as entrenched with the source material, that might be tough. So, like, I really want to, and I think quantity does have a quality all of its own. But also, I have seen, even on, like, YouTube or, like, and Dan Carlin is kind of operating his own little world right now, but if it's really good, people care. And I don't know exactly, like, I'm still learning. And this may prove to be the sort of thing that, like, with Compendium, people don't expect an episode every 2 to 3 weeks, and they're perfectly fine every month and a half to 2 months getting a show, and it's good. And that works. I'm hoping that that's more of the case, because I just don't know how I would put together, like, big shows like I want to do them.
It should be said that your episodes are normally 4 to 5 hours long, maybe longer. And most of the time, I've always just thought for me, like 30 minutes is the episode length that I'm, not even that I'm going for, just like that it tends to be. Like when I have the idea, like it somehow it always ends up when I press stop on the recording, like 28 minutes, 23 minutes, 37 minutes, like it's always around there. But like sometimes I think, hey, maybe I should, when I do like the Aztec series, maybe just combine them all together and put out 1 5. And I actually did that. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah,
but,
I saw that. How did that go on YouTube? Because I have been like, I wanted to add a video element to kind of make it a little bit easier I'll go into ChatGPT sometimes and be like, hey, give me a content strategy for this audio only show that I can't really cut up into short form bits and I can't really take advantage of any of these social platforms. It kind of is just, it's the podcast and I want to take advantage of these other things, but it just doesn't really fit.
Yeah. So for the listeners out there, I did this 8-part series on the Aztec Empire and released 1 part every 3 weeks. And I felt like, hey, maybe I'll do something different this time. And I was 100% inspired by Fall of Civilizations podcast.
Yeah, that's exactly what I
thought. Incredible video podcast operation he's got going. I was like, hey, maybe I should try to do something like that. And so what I did was I basically strung together all 8 parts into one video, and I added, videos and diagrams and, footage of the geography, and
it was like a 5-hour thing,
YouTube
right?
video. Yeah, so that's what it is. And it's living on there, and people have commented that they've liked it. It has not gotten thousands or tens of thousands of views, but that's probably the thing I'm most proud of ever doing in a very weird way. Something I've never even done before, which is, like if you said, what is reflecting history? Like just play that video. Like that's what it is. And that video took me, I don't know, 100 hours to make, like maybe more. So yeah, the question you asked is great. It was like kind of hidden in that question was like, is it worth it to do this? And the answer is like my answer for the rest of these. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I put my RSS feed onto YouTube, so it's going to be a static.
Definitely worth doing.
Yeah, it'll be a static thing for now, and maybe if I can figure out a way to add in some video. I've tried to do some to take advantage of the short form thing, trying to make like some trailers or like for 5, I've got the intro. I've recorded a couple different intros, and I just took one of those intros and added photos to it and captions, and it'll be a video, and hopefully people will watch it and go listen.
And that brings me to my last sort of piece of the advice here, which is promotion is now, I think, part of the game, and it's literally a full-time job. If you want to be good, and you would know way more than me because you are much better than me at the Instagram stuff and the TikTok stuff, and but yeah, like you have to think of those social media platforms you just have to think about them. Back when I started, you didn't have to think about that. Like I just made my podcast, I released it, people from out of nowhere, like, kind of reached out, and, a small community was built. But I think today, I don't think you can do that anymore because just the volume of stuff is so massive, and people are on these other platforms so much, and the long form, I think, is getting kind of crowded out. But yeah, I have been doing, and I'm not good at it because promotion is just not my personality. Like I'm not a salesman or a marketer, so I like literally cringe when I post. It's kind of like the opposite of what you were saying earlier, where sometimes you worry about what's in your podcast. I worry about what's in my, YouTube reels. Like, so, but yeah, like I think if you're making a podcast in the modern day, you have to have that. And what has worked for me a little bit is what you just said, where you just take a snippet of your podcast, add a little video over it, make it a little short. Don't worry about it. Post it. Sometimes it'll do well, sometimes it won't, but don't sit there and count the views.
Yeah, it's interesting for me because I started making social content not related to history before I started the history show. And so I had the cadence of making videos on TikTok beforehand, and like it helped so much, and yet it was also a hindrance because now I think about content as prioritization. And I've thought so much the past few months about like how do I want to show up on the internet? And what do I want people to think about the stuff that I make, or think about here it is. When people think about me, what are they thinking? Are they thinking the guy who makes videos on TikTok, or are they thinking the guy who makes the history podcast? I really want people to think I'm the guy who makes the history podcast. And so I have changed up a lot of the stuff that I've been doing on social media and how I've been showing up on social media, because now I feel like social media is more in service of the podcast. I think the podcast is the thing that I believe in the most, and I'm sort of hitching my wagon to. I'm still trying to figure out like how do you do social media with a show that you're not really promoting? Like, you're not just taking clips of and throwing it on social like it's an interview show. Like, you've got your social content already there if you do video and it's an interview show. You don't have to make any net new content. But with this, you don't really have that already made content. You have to make some net new stuff most of the time in order to promote it. I've found, at least it's worked a little bit, and some of this, it's different because it's like a unique situation where I already sort of had an audience, and then kind of tack this thing onto it. So it's not necessarily to say like, do this and you'll get X result, because you never know. But making videos that's just like talking head videos related to something that I might have talked about in the podcast, or just like showing up and being really active, or I've tried making like goofy historical fact videos that are really fun. And a couple of them have done really well, and most of them don't do very well, but I think you're 100% right. Showing up on social media is sort of an obligation, unless there's a prioritization happening where, like, in order to make the show, I can't show up on social. I think you sort of need to have a North Star, because otherwise you'll burn out. And, I was making YouTube videos, I was making TikTok videos, and I was making the podcast for a couple months. And like, there's just no way I can do all that. I was trying to make like 5 short form videos a week, a YouTube video a week, and release a podcast every 6 weeks, which is absolutely insane. And my wife was like, stop. And I was like, okay, I probably should chill out. And so it's like, hey, if I can get 3 or 4 TikToks a week, no YouTube videos, and just work on the podcast. And we'll see. It's kind of a work in progress, but I do think you're right. Social media is key, but I think you need to protect yourself, and sort of have a North Star of what you're trying to do. And if you're going to go do social media, it might not just be like, hey, let's throw clips on the podcast. It might be something a little bit different.
Yeah, and I think all that makes a lot of sense. I think, yeah, to be clear, what you said is absolutely true, where if you're trying to research a podcast, at the level that I want it to be done at, and you're trying to record that podcast and edit that podcast and organize ideas and, potentially make a video podcast for it on YouTube and also make short clips, like you are doing a lot of stuff. You're doing 5 people's full-time jobs, and you're competing against an algorithm that prioritizes shows that are fantastic, but I'm willing to bet a lot of money that they have marketing teams that make their, short form clips, and they have podcast networks behind them, promoting their stuff. And, like example, the Rest is History podcast, like one of my favorite podcasts, awesome podcast. Tom Holland, Dominic Sandbrook, incredible historians. But like I would be shocked if Tom Holland was sitting there.
He's not.
And Adobe Audition editing, YouTube shorts, like that would be stunning information.
Yeah, he is not doing that.
So when you're kind of in that sort of independent space like we are, you're at a disadvantage in that realm. And increasingly, I think that is where sort of the game is played as far as gathering listeners, to some extent. My 2 favorite history podcasters are Dan Carlin and Paul Cooper, Fall of Civilizations podcast. So I've never seen either of them post anything ever, as far as like TikToks or YouTubes or
they don't do anything.
Instagrams.
No.
Yeah, so it can be done, but the reality is like I'm not as good as those guys. So,
well, I think some of it too is there's a unicorn element. Like Dan, for example, history podcasters the world round will sing his praises forever and ever because I think he's done something exceptional and unique. He is unique. Like he comes in with like a radio background. And so he's got an element when he started that nobody else had. Like he was a presenter. And also he approached it with like a historian's level of attention to detail. And so you put those 2 things together and you have somebody that's working on like a huge advantage to everybody else. And so that in and of itself is just so unique. And Paul Cooper, I think his is a little bit different, but like he's a historian and he produces these incredibly well-produced podcasts that are very, very long and incredibly well-researched. And then he also was doing the video podcast thing and they blew up on YouTube. And like once you have that moment of virality, it kind of is all like it develops a momentum and it just sort of is a snowball and it builds up. And if you keep going and you continue delivering at the quality that you've always been delivering at, like people will keep coming back for more. So there's like a unicorn element to both of them, but also at the end of the day, the common theme with all the ones that do it really well, Rest is History included, Mike Duncan included, they make really damn good podcasts. And like ultimately that is the thing that I think has developed their success. Yeah, they've gotten lucky. I'm sure a lot of different ways they've gotten lucky. And sometimes it is better to be lucky than good. But at the end of the day, they all make really awesome podcasts.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. And, and I think it connects to what we said earlier about your kind of reasons for getting into the game. The goal should be to aspire to be as good as those guys. The goal should be to want to be at that level of attention to detail and production and research and interestingness. And is interestingness a word? I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the goal should not be to reach the level of listeners that they have, or to reach the level of followers they have, or to reach the level of influence, right? You're getting the cart before the horse. Classic Stannis Baratheon
Yep.
mix up there.
Yeah, there's a guy that I know through social, and he's about to start a history show, and he's starting with World War I. And I keep telling him, like, woof, good luck, man. Way to start with, what's the phrase? Like, I don't know. That's a heck of a subject to start things out with.
Especially because I think Blueprint for Armageddon is...
Oh, gosh, it's amazing.
I think that's the greatest podcast ever.
It's so good. Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you this, but the opening line of his second show in that of that series, the line is, "How much time do you spend on the development of a gap?" And sometimes I'm just sitting, at work, or I'm just watching a game, or I'm hanging out, and I just think, how much time do you spend on the development of a gap? Like, it's the perfect opening line.
I didn't know if we were going to go here, but I'm so stoked to go here and yeah. I love that, like, you brought that up and I knew exactly where you're going with it. Yeah. How much time do you spend on a gap? It's an incredible line. He also has two of the best closing lines of a podcast I've ever heard in my life. It's the Celtic Holocaust. I don't remember, and I don't remember the exact line, but it's the thought. He ends the Celtic Holocaust about Caesar's Gallic Wars with, and these are like the same structure of an ending, both of these. But the first one's the Celtic Holocaust, where he's talking to his babysitter or a nanny or something when he's a kid. And he, tells her that the Celts were defeated by the Romans in Caesar's Gallic Wars at the Battle of, I think it's Alesia. And Caesar takes back Vercingetorix and kills him in Rome. And it's a tragedy. It's the end of the Celts. And the babysitter, the nanny, or whoever the person is, maybe it's an aunt or something, I'm not sure. She goes, "What do they speak in Ireland?" The Celts aren't gone yet. And it's, just, and he did a very, very similar ending to Twilight of the Aesir 2, when he's talking about like myth and the battles of religion, and how Thor maybe is just as relevant as Jesus. And he's being hyperbolic to some extent, but just like the ideas there, the liners, oh my gosh. Like I go back and listen. I bought Celtic Holocaust because I love that line. And I've bought several of his shows, but
go ahead.
Do you sit and think about lines like that? Like I agonize over endings, because like there's endings like that exist, and I'm like, I really want to leave somebody with kind of like an ending image where they go, oh, wow. And they just sort of sit for a minute. Like I almost want to just have a moment of silence when it's done. Like if I did it right, you just sort of sit there and maybe you don't say anything, but you just sort of sit there for 10 seconds and you go, okay, cool. And then maybe carry on with your day.
I think I don't get into the level of, I'm going to script this exact sentence to be my ending necessarily. I did for my Aztec memories, I knew that I wanted "What's in a Name" to be the first line.
Which is a great line, by the way.
Thank you. Because it just fit perfectly. Like, okay, we're going to go from Shakespeare and this idea of like narratives and stories, and we're going to go right into what words mean, and that's going to lead us right into the Aztecs, and it's going to be perfect. So, sometimes I guess I will think about it, but usually I'm not at that level where I'm thinking about like a specific sentence. But I definitely do think about if I'm reading something while I'm researching and it's interesting, then I'll write down like, okay, intro idea here, maybe, or conclusion idea, maybe, something. And then by the end of it, I might have 3 or 4 different ways to end it. And this is something, I think to your point, that I've been thinking about more recently. So I think for the first like 50 episodes, I never really thought much about the I don't know what the word is, kind of the storyboarding of the podcast. It was more about, transmitting the information and, making my points and setting up themes, right?
Yeah.
But more recently, I've kind of gotten into, okay, like what is the story here?
Yeah, I've started thinking a lot more. I think a lot about the first couple minutes and then the last like 5 to 10 minutes. And everything in between, it's more just like the events. But I always try and think of a show as like there's going to be a theme or an idea that strings it all together. And then the ending is going to sort of capitalize or leave you with some thought or something at the end of it that just sort of lingers. And ideally, if I do everything right, the beginning is impactful and the ending is really impactful. And like I've noticed this with books and movies too, like especially with movies. I think you can forgive a whole lot in a movie if the ending's awesome. And I think the ending is honestly most of the time when I'm thinking about movies, and there's exceptions to this, but a lot of the times I'm just thinking about how did it end? Mm-hmm. How did it all come together? And there's some movies that are just experiences and you love them for what they are, but I do think like the ending will sort of shape your feelings about something and honestly cover up a whole lot of garbage. If the ending's awesome, but the middle's terrible, like I would so much rather the ending be really good and the middle be bad than the inverse.
There's a psychological memory concept. I don't remember what it's called, but the idea is that we tend to remember the beginnings of things and we remember the ends of things, and we don't remember the middle of things very well. So, they can do experiments where they put letters up on a screen or words in a certain order, and you tend to remember the first word in a list and the last word in a list, but the middle gets very murky. You ever watch Mad Men?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a great line, and these are the things I think about just randomly during the day. But I guess Don Draper is kind of known as a little bit of a womanizer. He bounces around from person to person, or I guess whatever, adulteress to adulteress, at least for the first couple seasons. And I think the casual observer thinks he's doing this because he's, like a macho, like cool dude. And it's like, oh, look how cool he is, getting with all these women. But, the reality is like he's got these deeper kind of psychological traumas going on, and he's kind of deeply damaged. And that's kind of the point of the show. But anyway, like one of these girls that he ends up like kind of leading her on a little bit, and then he ends up dumping her for like a younger, hotter version. And the girl goes, that's okay, because eventually she's going to find out that you only like the beginnings of things.
Mm.
And it's like, boom, like that's a line. But I think about that
That's
a
an
lot,
amazing line,
because
yeah.
like, it's kind of what you were saying, where like, you remember those intros, you remember those first 5 minutes, but you might not remember the other things. And it's the same with people, first
Yeah.
impressions.
And it is like, that might be one of those, I have taken, I mean, I will sing Carlin's praises till, I mean, infinity. But I have taken probably several things from how he does a show. But that was one thing, like just analyzing, okay, what works? What do I like? Trying to internalize what I'm enjoying and try and take that and apply it. That was one of the really practical things of like, okay, agonize over a beginning, agonize over an ending, and the middle stitch the two together and just sort of get from point A to point B. And I found like I tend to naturally kind of do that now, where I'm like kicking around different ideas for both. Like in 5, the ending, I think, or the beginning, I probably only had like 2 different versions of. The ending, I might have had 5. Just like record it and see if it's how it lands, and then record another one and be like, oh, I kind of like this part of it better, and then record another one and be like, oh, I kind of like this little part, and then you stitch them together. And yeah, I tried that so dramatically, and it's indulgent too. I think that's the word that I think about them when I'm listening to them. Like, I know this is indulgent. I know there's probably somebody that's like, oh my God,
Yeah.
this is so extra. But like, I love it. So I'm sure there's probably other people that love that as well. And I'm sure there's people that listen to Carlin and think this is so indulgent. He's just like, he's going so far with this, but like, it's awesome. And I did this with the 1066 show, where there's an ending I felt like at the time, like so goofy. And people liked it. People were like, oh, that ending was cool. And it was one of those things where I was like, okay, well, I guess some people liked it. I guess it worked.
And, we're kind of bouncing around here, but to go back to advice for new history podcasters or just people who are interested in history podcasts, like, to me, that's a huge piece of advice, is that, you are not making this for the audience, and that's important. Like, you're making it for yourself. And then that relationship gets built, and then you care about your audience, and then there is some, okay, like maybe there's some negotiating with that process. But, all that being said, you are not the best judge of what's good and what's not good.
Yeah.
And we know this in psychology and in history. Like, you as a human being individually are not always the master arbiter of what's in your own best interest. And you don't behave that way, and you don't think that way, and you don't always act that way. So, trust that your process is good, and trust in your audience, right? And I think if they feel that you have their interests in mind, and they can trust you, and you're doing it for the right reasons, then they're going to give you the benefit of the doubt, I think, most of the time.
Yeah, at least that's been somewhat the case, at least in my experience so far. I think this is something that like you can't quantify, or you can't say, here's step 1, step 2, step 3. Because I've tried to replicate, or I've tried to study the steps of how a thing works and then do those steps to make the thing work. And it doesn't work every time you just try and create a formula that will get you an end result. Like, it's a very organic process. And like, I've been creating different types of content on the internet for, 7-8 years. And it's been in a lot of different ways, and like it might work to a certain extent, but it's not quite tenable or fulfilling, and so like I end up pivoting or trying to change it somehow. And I guess where I'm going with it is like this whole creative process is so organic, and I think if you get to a point where people are along for the ride with you, and they're like right there with you, and you know they're there, that does feel like it sort of changes the game a little bit.
Yeah.
It feels like you're not really creating it alone anymore. And I think, and again, like I try and say this as often as possible, like in every show at the end of it, just like have this long thing about like, hey, this means a lot that you stuck through this. And I try not to be like cringy about it, but like it does. And kind of creating that, it's a one-way relationship, but it's a two-way relationship. And having those conversations, and like that's the thing I'm struggling with right now, is like trying to figure out a way to kind of close that loop and make that one-way relationship more of a two-way relationship. And that's been difficult to do, just because it's like I create the thing and put it out and people listen to it, and then, process, rinse and repeat.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more.
Thank you so much for checking out this interview with Matt. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you got a lot out of it. And if you want to listen to part 2 over in Matt's podcast feed, go check that out. I'll have a link to that in the show notes below. Also, now that we have finished Hell in a Small Place, part 5 came out about a week ago. If you are supporting the show on Patreon, you got an extra episode, a Hell in a Small Place extra show that nobody else gets. So if you want to listen to that, if you want to have an extra 30-ish minutes of content, if you want to listen to me wax poetic about Bernard Fall and what he meant to our understanding of the Vietnam War, consider supporting the show on Patreon. I'll have a link to that in there as well. And if you want to get weekly updates from me in your email inbox through Substack, I've got a link to that as well. It's not just updates about the podcast. There's also some bonus content in there as well. There's some historical nuggets or just personal essays or whatever I'm feeling at the moment. But there's all sorts of things over there in Substack, so consider showing up there as well. Thank you so much for all of your support. I really could not do this without you, and I'm so excited to jump into what's next for the podcast. Now that we've finished Hell in a Small Place, I'm deep in research for what comes next here in the podcast feed, and I can't wait to share that with you. Until we meet again, stay safe, and I'll see you again very, very soon.